Yeah, so I think sometimes people are really surprised about the range of records you can ask for. So you can ask for things like uh, m- uh, meeting minutes, presentations, things that aren't public record, uh, and you can also ask for things that are a little bit more detailed, like emails between government officials and uh, corporate players. You can ask for their correspondence that is sometimes written if they're taking notes. So so I think that it's good to include a range of types of records when you're asking for something regarding an event or a process. And I'll say a little bit more about that when I get into the presentation. But basically what I would say is assume you can ask for whatever kind of record you want and go for it, because you can get a lot of really fine-grained detailed records like emails. For instance, I often ask for emails of government officials or police. Another thing you can ask for, and I would say this is a little bit different, is you can ask for data sets. You can ask for data. So remember that example of Leslie Young. They didn't ask for any emails or anything. They just asked for a database. And it helps if you know what the name of the database is, if you have a tip on what that might be. But you can ask for data, and it comes in an Excel file, a CSV file. So increasingly, uh, journalists and activists and scholars are asking for data instead of records like a presentation or an email. And a good example would be Tom Cardoso. I don't know if anyone knows of the journalism of Tom Cardoso, but they're a data journalist, and they're always asking for databases. So they'll ask for databases regarding, the number of people in segregation in CSC institutions over a 10-year span. And then they can see how frequently people are being put into segregation, and whether the government is actually not doing what it said it was going to do and stop putting people in segregation. And they can see the span of time. With a data set, you might not see individual names. You just have cases. You have rows of data. But from that, you can find out, something's happening that the government said shouldn't be happening, or it's happening at a much higher rate than the government said it was going to happen at. So that's why I think asking for data can be very useful. Now, there are some things that you probably won't get because there are all these exemptions. So if you ask for cabinet records, there's a privilege for cabinet ministers. There's a privilege for certain government officials. Those are really hard to get, and sometimes, I've heard that if a unit or an agency doesn't want some data to be disclosed or some record to be disclosed regarding some meeting, they'll invite someone who has cabinet level status to the meeting, and then they can just say, well, that's a cabinet confidence. So there are some of these pitfalls out there with the exemptions where you can still request the record. You can still make a request, but you might not get it because there's that exemption regarding cabinet confidences. There's some other ones too, like ongoing criminal investigation. It's very difficult to get information regarding ongoing criminal investigation, or if police say that's what's happening, then that can be used to exempt the records. Third-party information. So if there's a corporation involved in the records are deemed to be in the custody of the corporation, that's another one where they can say, we can't release those records. That said, there's lots of examples where we can get records where, you know, the practices of corporations, the traces of the kind of corporate state symbiosis that is very much involved in things like pipelines and extractive industries, we can get records, and some of it might be redacted, but not all of it. So it's still worth making the requests, even if, you know, some of these things you know they're in play with the issue you're making a request about.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. It's helpful to know what we can expect and what we can't expect to be able to access. So Kevin, I'll invite you to share your screen and go ahead and provide us with the training, and I'll let folks know that when Kevin's done, we will have time for questions. So feel free to, you can start posting your questions in the chat now as they come up if you want, and we'll come back to them when Kevin's done.
Yeah, so let me just get this going here. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So just one little thing at the get-go here. When I say ATI as a shorthand, I'm referring to federal level access to information. At the federal level, it's called access to information. And if it's a provincial level request or a municipal level request, that's covered under different legislation in each province and territory, referred to usually as something like Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. At the federal level, the Access to Information Act and the Privacy Act, they're distinct, whereas at the provincial and territorial levels, they're combined. And that's important because under the Privacy Act at the federal level, you can also make requests for your own personal information. That's something I should have mentioned in response to your previous question, but you can make requests for your own personal information under the Privacy Act federally. So basically, today I'm going to talk about how to make these requests, but I'm also going to suggest that it's important to incorporate ATI and FOI into activism, into advocacy, into, you know, sometimes the way that journalism and activism and scholarship can just kind of be merged together in a messy kind of way. It can be incorporated into that kind of practice, and also critical lawyering. If movement groups have a lawyer or work with lawyers, lawyers can also be doing some of this work too. I think that ATI FOI is a really good tool for studying government agencies and state conduct. I'll give you some examples later on about the way that I've used it, and hopefully what I'll have to say will convince you a little bit that is the case. And then the other thing I wanted to mention before getting into the details is that I really do think that people who are on the front lines of struggle, people who are on the front lines of mobilization and really putting their bodies out there for justice, can know things about the practices of the state that can really inform ATI and FOI requests quite importantly. So when you are engaged in some kind of struggle and you're dealing with police every day, that you're dealing with surveillance from different agencies, and there might be these other personnel from these other agencies, like it could be agencies that don't seem to have anything to do with policing or security, but they're there in partnership working with RCMP. You notice things, you notice numbers, or you notice insignia, you see the formations they're in, you see what time they're showing up, you can see they went to a meeting somewhere at some time. I would take field notes about all these things, jot them down, because that can actually be really important. Like if you can say, we know police showed up to this town at this time on this day, and we know they left this time this other day, then that's the time span for a series of requests. And you wouldn't know that unless you were really there, immersed in the milieu. So that's why I would suggest, people who are engaged in frontline mobilization can have a lot of insights into how requests should be worded. I would also say that people doing frontline activism work and land defense and water protection are already doing a lot of important work, and maybe you don't have time to submit ATI and FOI requests. So partnering or collaborating with groups like Research for the Frontlines, like other groups, to share your insights and get other people to make the request on your behalf is a good strategy, because people only have so much time and energy they can dedicate to these things. Okay, so here's just a little overview of the process we'll walk through. First, researching the request, what that entails, submitting the request. It's not as straightforward as it may seem. The messy part, but also a part that can really make or break the request, the negotiation phase, then what happens during the waiting game that often unfolds, and then what to do with the data. Okay, so first of all, when it comes to researching the request, generally the more specific you can be, the better the request is going to go. So I think you have to have an idea of what you're looking for, but you also want to be able to mention a record type or a database. You might want to be able to mention the specific personnel involved. And this can seem like a kind of daunting task, because sometimes these agencies, they are sort of obscure by design. So you can work with journalists, you could work with academics who might be able to figure some of this stuff out and do some of the research, or you might have some of the insights, again, from interacting with some of these government personnel. Sometimes it's available online. Sometimes a journalist has already reported on it. I would say another dimension of it is sometimes, occasionally, people know someone who works in government, or people know someone who works with someone who works in government. And I just kind of like approach it like an investigative journalist. Like, if I know someone like that, I'm kind of going to work my sources. I'm going to try to find out what I can about the issue. And again, you might have experience that gives you some clues. So all this being said is you want to research the request to make it as specific as possible to begin with. And it's not only the record types, but it's also the timeline. So the more specific you can be, the better the request is going to go, the quicker you're going to get the records back. So if you know that some event of some police team, it just happened during this week, you don't need to ask for all the records in 2021. You can just ask for this week. If you know that it happened in a particular jurisdiction of the government agency, you don't need to ask for all the records from all sections or all jurisdictions. So you can really narrow it down, and then it'll be a little more effective. So just a bit more on strategies here. I would say, yeah, we want to work towards targeted requests. Like, we want to be able to say, we know this meeting took place. We know there was a presentation. We heard there was some presentation from some corporation to this government agency. We want to be able to have very targeted requests, but sometimes we don't quite have the research yet to get to that point. So it's okay if you do start with broad requests. It's okay if you ask broadly about some files and some practices, and you don't have dates and record types quite yet. So sometimes if I'm just starting out a project, I will start with broad requests, and I'll just see what I get. And I learn about the specifics to make targeted requests by going through the disclosure from the broad requests. Or if I know some journalists have already done some broad requests on the agency, I'll just ask them for their records. Increasingly, people using ATI and FOI, they're sharing the records so that you can give someone else a head start on their research. So try to find some disclosures. And one other place to look is on the federal government access to information website hub. There is one database of previous disclosures, and you can request those. You can just say, please send me this one, and they'll send it to you because someone's already made a request and it's out there. That's a good way. That's to get some information that's kind of like making a broad request. The only thing about that database is we know it's not fully populated. They withhold some of the requests and some of the information that should be in there, which is a political process. So however you get to making a targeted request, that's how it will be. It could be you start out making broad requests, could be you get some disclosures from somebody else, you go through them, you figure out what you want to ask about. And I guess another kind of targeted request is a Privacy Act request. Privacy Act request is a similar process, but you're invoking the Privacy Act when you write up the request, and you're making a request for your own personal information. So if you were monitored by RCMP, if you were monitored by CBSA or some other agencies, and you had this experience, and you know when it happened this week, it happened at this site and that site, you can make a Privacy Act request for records pertaining to your own person. And I'll post a link later, and we'll share a link on the event page directing you to these things, so you don't have to search around for them yourself. Okay, so you've done the research and you've thought about your strategy a little bit. Is it going to be broad, targeted? And then you're going to prepare your request. You're going to write it up, and it's pretty straightforward. You might put your mailing address. You might put the way you want to be referred to. You might then mention the act you're invoking. It's either going to be Access to Information Act or the Privacy Act, or if it's provincial, territorial, or municipal, it's going to be the FIPA law in that jurisdiction. And then you're going to write something like, I'm requesting all of these, all of those for this date range. You can put, please exclude this, please exclude that. You can put some little caveats in there, and you will specify what language you want the records in. If you want them in French and or English, you will specify the format that you want them in. Some people like to receive the paper copies. Some people like it on a CD. Some people, if you're making a data request, you want it in CSV or Excel, and you want it readable. You don't want them to lock the rows. You want to be able to work on it like it's an Excel form. And then you might pass it by somebody that you work with. You might say, can you read this request? Can you think of anything else I should add in here? Would you change the time range or anything like this? I always bounce my requests off of collaborators. And then sometimes I'll make multiple requests at the same time for the same issue. Like, let's say I wanted some kinds of security intelligence reports from CSIS on a particular topic. I wouldn't ask for one big request, everything from 2018 to the present. I would break it up in 6-month chunks, probably. I would break it up. So I might end up with 6 or 8 requests. So I might end up with multiple requests. And the reason why I would do that is, one, it might be more tricky to manage on their end, because they're going to have to do all these consultations to search for the records. It might be a bit more expensive because there are some expenses for disclosures when you have big requests, not usually for targeted requests. And then there could be delays as well. The bigger the request, the bigger the timeline, the bigger the delay. So if I am looking at something where there's a span of time I'm studying something in, I'll break it into multiple requests. Usually works a little better. Or I'll work in teams. Like if I have a team of people I'm working with, then I'll ask them to do this year. I'll do another year. I'll ask somebody else to do a different year. And in that way, it doesn't seem like I'm taxing the ATI system too much. Now, there's a couple of ways to submit your request. It used to be that you had to mail it in, and I'll show you after a website where all of the addresses, all the mailing addresses for federal access coordinators, that's who you send your request to, they're there, and you can just grab the address and mail it to them. But increasingly, things are moving online. Federally, it's already online, and there's only a couple of agencies that are holding out and haven't moved into the online system. And provincially too, there's quite a number of provinces that have online access systems, and a territory as well does. So increasingly, you just submit it through your computer or your phone. And usually there's a little fee, maybe a $5 fee. Some places there's no fees. And frustratingly, in Alberta, there's a $25 fee. And really shockingly, or maybe not so shockingly, Horgan's NDP government in BC right now wants to ratchet up the fees to $25 per request as well. And there's been quite a lot of animosity about that this week, because obviously that's not in the interests of access to information. The headline was taking the free out of freedom of information. So one little thing to keep in mind about your request is government agencies and government workers have a lot of odd terminology for referring to us, for referring to social life, and referring to the world. So for instance, agencies like CSIS, they make up some of these categories like multi-issue extremism to refer to environmental and social justice activists, land defenders, and water protectors. And they'll have reports on multi-issue extremists. This is a category that actually emerged in relation to mobilizations against the 2010 Olympics in British Columbia. And it's a category that they literally invented it to refer to the multi-sector, broad social resistance to the Olympics that came together, and the solidarity that was there. They couldn't really refer to it quickly without coming up with this odd term. Once you figure out what kind of odd terms they use, though, it can be really helpful, because then you can ask for all threat assessments regarding multi-issue extremists for a certain date range. Or they might refer to their various partnerships with corporate players in different ways that don't really make a lot of sense to us, but they come up with a moniker to refer to it. So this is another kind of thing that you want to do research on and figure out, like, what are these terms they're using? Sometimes journalists will report on it. Sometimes you might overhear it if you're really engaging with people on the front lines. Any clue you get about one of these things, it's good. Then you can use it in a request. Another thing you can also ask for if you're making a kind of broad request, or it's one thing to consider as part of your strategy, is organizational maps and parent files. So an organizational map doesn't give you a lot of detail or content about some phenomena, but it tells you who all the players are. It tells you maybe what their network connections are. That can be useful, because then you can use that for subsequent requests. Once you have the map of the network, you can say, I want all the correspondence between this node and that node, and I want all of the meeting minutes between this node and that node. And another thing that can be good is sometimes there's a parent file. A parent file is a file that lists all of the other types of records that are in the custody of that unit. So again, it doesn't give you a lot of detail or content by itself, but once you see the parent file, you can see all the record types in that unit. Then you can start to say, oh, I want this one, I want that one, I want this other one. Okay, so you did your homework, you sent it off. Now, that's not the end of the story. In fact, this is really the beginning of the process in some ways, because you will deal with this person named an ATI coordinator or an FOI coordinator. They work in the agency that you're asking for records from, but they're supposed to be kind of arm's length. Increasingly, they do have a kind of professional training in records management, and they do take it fairly seriously, although sometimes I've had seconded officers in the RCMP working the ATI desk and things like that, who clearly, are not arm's length. They're totally invested in the agency. So not all ATI coordinators are divested politically from the agency, but they're going to come back to you on your request. They're going to send you an email, or you can ask them to call you. I like to chat with them on the phone, get them talking, and they're going to ask you some questions like, what do you mean by this phrase, or what do you mean by these types of documents? And to be honest, a lot of times they're asking because they just want to make their own jobs easier. They don't know, every record in the organization. They have limited knowledge of the records there, and what they have to do is they have to go to the actual unit where these records are, like not walk there, but they have to go to the unit and say, I got this request, what do you got? And then the unit manager is going to talk to their workers. The unit manager is going to say, got this request, what do we got? And then the whole chain of communication goes back to the coordinator. So you can help the coordinator by sometimes clarifying, working with them. You can also quiz them, send them some queries, and they might go to the unit and ask some questions and come back to you. That's a good way to learn something about the unit that you're investigating, because the ATI coordinator kind of has to pose those questions of clarification to the unit and come back to you. And they will talk to you about the date range. They might revise the request, and that's okay. It's okay at this stage to revise your request a little bit if you want to. Just get it in writing. Whatever the revised wording of the request is, get it in writing so that you're clear on what you're moving ahead with. Now, I will say, sometimes the coordinators are doing something else. They're trying to talk you off your spot, so to speak. They're trying to get you off of your position and get you off your wording in your timeline. So if you feel confident that your wording and your timeline is good and you want to proceed with that, then don't feel like you have to change your wording. But if you feel like you have good rapport with the coordinator and you feel like, hey, they found out something and that's compelling, I want to go with that. You can change it at this time, and you can change it up until the minute they submit it. So, I like to make contact with the coordinators. I like to keep in contact with them, try to have good rapport with them to the extent you can. It's not totally possible with some of the coordinators. And then there's a couple agencies where the coordinators are just, it's like they don't exist as people. Like, I've never talked to a CSIS ATI coordinator on the phone. That's not possible. It's all through correspondence, and they're unnamed persons that you're corresponding with. But with other agencies, they're people, they're workers. Some of them are really passionate about freedom of information, actually, and they want to see the requests work. They believe in it. So yeah, there's a variation there, and you just have to kind of get a feel for it. The other thing here you can do in these negotiations is use precedents. So for instance, right now I'm working on a project where I'm asking for a lot of COVID-related records pertaining to prisons and jails in Canada. And some of the provinces, when I'm negotiating with the coordinators, they're like, we can't give you that. We're not going to give you those records. They kind of balk at the request. And then I'll say something like, well, actually, I got those records back from this jurisdiction in less than 30 days. They didn't seem to have a problem. So why is it that you can't do it in this jurisdiction? And sometimes, then they come back to you the next day and they say, okay, we'll proceed. So if you know of a precedent from your own research or from past research, then you can say that. And in this sense, I refer to the negotiation and clarification process as a kind of feral lawyering. You kind of have to think like a lawyer. You have these precedents and you're invoking them, and it's kind of like a chess match against the coordinator. It's not that antagonistic, but sometimes you have to invoke precedent. You have to say, this was released in this jurisdiction. There was no redaction, no exemption. So why is it that you can't do the same thing? It's that kind of feral lawyering, I think, that can make a difference sometimes in the negotiation phase. Okay, so then it goes out with the wording, either the original wording or the revised wording. It goes out, and sometimes you'll get it back in 30 days. Most places it's 30 working days they have to respond. It depends on how big the request is. If it's a bigger request, you'll probably get an extension. If there's a lot of network connections to the records, and by that I mean, like, let's say it was some kind of security network of multiple federal agencies working on some kind of policing project, like at G8, G20, all of them are working together in a network, right? So they have to consult all those agencies before they send out the records. They have to say, we got these records, you're mentioned in them, we're going to send them out, but can we get your okay? And they have to say that to like 12 agencies if 12 different agencies have some kind of stake in the records. So that can take time. And that's what a lot of the extensions are, is they're just consulting on the records with other units. And then there's a little bit of time that goes into redaction. And that's when they look at the records and they look at the act. And if the act says, can't release personal information, can't release information regarding ongoing criminal investigation, they'll either redact it, they'll just strike some of it out, or they might sever the records completely and just cut that chunk of the records out. If the request is really stalled, really taking a long time, the extensions are months and months. This is a really frustrating part of it, because you can file a complaint at any point. You can file a complaint with the Access to Information Commissioner at the federal level, or the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Commissioner, or sometimes they're called an ombudsperson in different jurisdictions. You can file a complaint actually at any time, but that won't get you anywhere fast because they have a kind of backlog of cases too. They're working on cases from many months ago. So you can complain. You could submit a new request with a smaller timeline or something more narrow. But frustratingly, sometimes there is, just waiting. When you are done waiting, when you get something in the email or in the regular mail, you're going to get what you asked for, hopefully, documents or CD or flash drive or e-post, whatever you asked for. If you get something that you didn't ask for, like recently, CSC emailed me all these paper copies of records when I specifically asked for electronic records. And they emailed me this box, or they mailed this box of records. I couldn't even lift it. It was like just this massive box of paper. Why would they do that? Because I think it's tougher to go through all of those paper records. And they might think, well, it'll get stuck in the mail somewhere for a while. I asked for electronic records, so then I had to say, no, I asked for electronic records, and then they sent them to me. See, it wasn't a problem. It was just some kind of ploy to frustrate the process a little bit. So if you ask for something specific, make sure you get it. You will also see in there a letter explaining what's redacted, what's exempted, what they basically struck out or what they cut out, and they'll invoke some of the sections of the Act. Now, that's not all bad. Like, even if you see a whole page blacked out and it says blacked out because of this section pertaining to foreign government, that's interesting. Like, let's say you were asking about some police practice at a protest or something, but it says, no, this is struck out because of correspondence with a foreign government. That's really interesting. That could be grounds for another request. That could be something to mobilize around and share with somebody, because even though you don't see exactly what it says, it is telling you something interesting, that there's something unexpected there. So I usually go through the requests, and I'm analyzing the data to see what I can use for academic work. I'm looking to see what I can use for advocacy work, if I can share it with a activist group. I'm looking for stuff I can share with journalists that maybe I can't use, but they could use. And I'm also looking for ideas for new requests. So if I see something really specific, if I see a meeting mentioned, oh, I didn't know about this meeting before. Now I know this meeting took place. I'm gonna send another request. If I see some new network players, I didn't know that this corporation was involved before. That's another set of requests. So once you get the request, again, it's not the end of it. It just kind of keeps going. If you're not happy with the redactions and the exemptions, you think that they were overbroad in their application of some of these sections of the legislation, and you see all of these pages, they're just completely obscure, page after page after page, and you think that's overbroad, like you went too far there. You can make a complaint to the commissioner. I mentioned the Federal Access to Information Commissioner, the provincial territorial commissioners. They will receive your complaint. They'll ask for all of the previous correspondence. So remember, if you changed the wording of your request, you want to have a record of that so you know what it was changed to. If you did have a lot of detailed correspondence with the ATI coordinator, it might be good to have some notes on that. So sometimes I'll make jottings in like a research diary, or I'll just write it down in a Word document. If I had an exchange with an ATI coordinator that really, it kind of changed the course of the request. And I know some researchers do this more religiously. They write down everything, every little detail of the life of every request. Because when it comes to the complaint process, if you can document, the coordinator did not provide, duty to document here, or they didn't provide another one of their duties there, then there could be some grounds for overturning the decision. And there's lots of journalists, lots of academics, lawyers who've received some records. They weren't happy with them. They made a complaint. The commissioner overturns the decision, and then the records are released. And so going to the commissioner, it takes some time. It takes a little bit more of that kind of feral lawyering work, because you do have to write up a little bit of a report on it and submit it. But again, I would say collaborate with people on that. You can run it by people. They might have some ideas about some stuff to put in there. And then the complaints process. The other thing about it is it kind of sets precedent too. If these agencies just get to keep doing this, keep sending us really bad disclosures that are totally exempted and redacted, they'll just keep doing it. But if we push back a little bit through the complaint system and the commissioner overturns a lot of their decisions, then it's one way to try to make things a little more open. So some of the commissioners have a complaints form that you have to fill out too. But usually I just write a report. I'll say, on this date, I submitted the request. This date, we corresponded. This date, we corresponded. This date, we changed the wording of the request. I got this correspondence. I got the records. I think it's overbroad for this reason. I think it's overbroad for that reason. It's like a little book report for the commissioner. Okay, so that being said, in all the ways that FOI and ATI can really feed into activism, I think, and feed into struggles for justice by interrogating state conduct, there are lots of problems. This is a flawed system, and I'm never gonna say, oh, ATI and FOI are so good, they're gonna lead to democracy and transparency. And I think it's we have to be more realistic about it. It's a flawed tool. It's a good tool, but there's flaws. So there can be delays and redaction and withheld information. With delays, some of them are going to happen because of the scope of the request, but some of them are going to happen because of the consultation again. They could also pertain to the exemptions listed in the legislation. So I think that the legislation in most jurisdictions as it stands really favors the government more than it favors the requester. And unfortunately, we've seen some legislative changes recently where they keep adding more exemptions, more and more exemptions, tougher exemptions, which means less access to information. So I do think that fighting for access laws that are more favorable to us is worth pushing for, because they're just going to keep throwing these exemptions in there that basically render it useless at some point. So the exemptions keep getting tougher to deal with. There's redaction too, where the classic image of a blacked out document is the one you think of regarding redaction, but increasingly the process is digital, and they will white out the file. And the reason why I think this is an issue when they use this ATIP software and they white out the file is then you can't actually see what was there, how much content was there. like, does this page keep going, or was that it? You can't really tell because it's just whited out there. So I think that the software is designed in that way to render it more opaque. And redaction is a problem because they can be really overbroad, and there could be a lot of variation again. Like I said, some of those ATI coordinators, they're very serious about being a professional FOI coordinator, and they're by the book. And there's others who are seconded police officers. So there's variation, and this is something to watch for in your disclosures. Like, are they really using the sections of the act in an overbroad way to redact some of the material that's there? Should you file a complaint if they have redacted things in an overbroad manner? A bigger problem, which we could kind of investigate using ATI and FOI, but I think maybe people who work in the civil service would be better positioned to blow the whistle on, is just the non-production of documents. Everything inside of government is supposed to be documented. They have a duty to document. And I think a lot of times they just don't. So they're supposed to take meeting minutes, but they don't. They're supposed to write things down, but they send them on Blackberries or whatever that aren't subject to ATI and FOI. So this is a much bigger problem of secrecy, I think. It's one thing to say, the ATI, FOI legislation, it works, but it's frustrating. But it's a whole other thing to examine the culture of secrecy in government as a kind of insidious dimension of it. And the non-production of documents is paramount there, I would say. So overall, this is an imperfect kind of tool. I would say, if you're studying government conduct, you're trying to investigate it as part of social movement strategy. You do want to use some other methodologies, get some other data points too, and see how you can work ATI and FOI in there. If you're interested, there's this 2015 edited volume. Anyone who wants a copy of it, I can mail you a copy of it, because I bought a bunch of them just to mail out to people doing activism. There's also some journal articles that are a bit more specific on things I can mail to you. Happy to print them out and mail them to you, or email them to you. Or I could just send them over and we could like post them somewhere or something. I don't know. But anyway, there's more details in there on how to do it. I would say the other part of it is that this is also a way of investigating how government communications are organized, and responding to FOI requests I would consider as part of government communications. So one thing you can do, one strategy, is submit an ATI request on all correspondence regarding your previous ATI request, or submit an FOI request on all correspondence regarding your previous FOI request. So if you submitted an ATI request on all of these police activities regarding a blockade at a particular site, particular timeline, and you get your disclosure, you can also submit a request on all the correspondence regarding that request. Did it go to the PMO? Did it go here? Did it go there? And that can also provide insights into how the government is managing risk and treating us as risky subjects, and in the way that they manage the flows of information. So just a couple of quick examples here before we get to questions. I've done research on CSIS and RCMP security intelligence practices. So in lead up to the 2010 Olympics, the G8, G20 in Toronto, Huntsville. Also in relation to Wet'suwet'en territory in British Columbia, and the various activities of those agencies there. And this is an example actually of a record. So you can see some kinds of correspondence in this email. And you might, in a disclosure, you might get 100, 200, 300 pages of emails like this. And then you go through them and you see what's really telling. So here it's about the relationship between CSIS, RCMP, and this entity called ITAC, used to be called the Integrated Threat Assessment Center, and now it's called the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center. And what it does is it creates threat assessments for these various other federal level security intelligence agencies. Also, policing agencies and regulatory agencies like National Capital Commission is one I investigated for a while. National Capital Commission around Ottawa-Gatineau, they have this kind of quasi-police force, and they go around policing people in all the NCC lands. They police people who are unhoused and who are marginalized and experiencing poverty, and they basically just push them out of the parks. So this is an example of an occurrence report. I asked for all occurrence reports of NCC conservation officers in different time ranges, and I got thousands of occurrence reports like this. And then I was able to analyze the trends in the occurrence reports, like who are they policing, where are they policing them, what do they do to them. You can see down here, the officer wrote expelled because he was not normal. So it gives you a sense of what they're doing. They're not, upholding any kind of rule of law. They're just enforcing this kind of normative order in these parks. This is a good example to mention too, because when you submit an ATI FOI request, most of the time you're asking for records, and you want the records sent to you, right? But the other option is to go to the site and examine the records on site. So actually for this one, there was a little bit of a problem, like they didn't want to reproduce all the records for me. They didn't want to photocopy 1,000 records and send them to me. So they said, you can come in here and you can take pictures of them if you want. So that's what I did, is I went to the NCC headquarters and I took pictures of all the occurrence reports. So there's some variation in terms of how you can access the records. Then there's, one thing that I do is I tend to examine obscure government agencies when I find out about them. So all of the nuclear facilities in Ontario, mostly, they have these nuclear response forces. And I find them really interesting because I find that they have militarized all of the local and provincial police around them, because they operate with a totally different approach to security. They're like these SWAT teams, basically, that patrol the grounds of power stations and medical isotope centers. And the SWAT teams, the nuclear response forces, they make the police in the surrounding region train in the same kind of tactics and use the same kind of weaponry. And it's all basically SWAT team stuff, because they participate in SWAT team tournaments, and they go to these kind of SWAT team tournaments all around North America. So by investigating the nuclear response forces, I was able to investigate how they lead to militarization of these local police detachments that then totally change their approach to policing and become more aggressive and have all of this really bizarre weaponry that they start spending, local taxpayer dollars on. And two other things I'll just mention. I've done a lot of studies on Correctional Service Canada, where with Justin Pichet at University of Ottawa mostly, what we do is we compare the rhetoric of the government agency on the front stage. Like, CSC will say, we're all about humane treatment, we're all about indigenizing corrections, and so on. We compare that with what the records from the backstage say about what's really happening. And so we'll like contrast the rhetoric of the agency with what their own records say about what's really happening in the institutions. So that's a kind of approach to research design we take, where we want to use their own records to undermine the public rhetoric that they communicate. I would also say that we can make requests in other countries too. We can make freedom of information requests in the United States. The United States Freedom of Information apparatus is actually, they just take it more seriously, I guess, than we do in Canada. So you can make requests at any level of government in the United States, especially if you think that some US agency is involved in whatever kind of security or intelligence operation that you might be investigating. And one thing that I've done is I was really interested in private sponsorship of public policing and what's called paid duty policing. That's when police basically get bought for an hour or two by some private buyer. One example that happens here all the time that I find incredibly frustrating is like hockey teams. Hockey teams, if you ever see police like walking around a hockey arena or walking around inside the hockey arena, and sometimes most of the time they're on paid duty. They're getting paid extra money, usually about $100 an hour, just to be a kind of mobile scarecrow in that space. So I submitted FOI requests across the United States in 70 different cities to get paid duty records and private sponsorship of public police records in all these little police departments, and found there's so much paid duty going on. There's so much corporate buying of public police power going on that it continues to astonish me. Okay, so last thing, I think it's important to be collaborative. A lot of times academic research is really like, academics are like real estate agents. They're really proprietary, and they're like, no, I don't want to work with you. No, that's my topic. They're really kind of shallow people sometimes. But if you can find academics who are not like that and who are collaborative and want to just, assist and give their time and their labor, then work with them to collaborate on some of this stuff. Work with lawyers and journalists too, because they're doing this a lot. They're submitting a lot of requests, sometimes for the same material. And in this sense, academics or lawyers or journalists could be a kind of go-between, because I know that people who are really on the front lines, mobilizing and engaged in struggle every day, don't necessarily have the time to do all this research, don't necessarily have the time to follow up on the requests all the time and work the coordinators and talk on the phone with them endlessly. So use academics or somebody as a kind of go-between. Work with them to try to get some records that can try to advance the struggles that you're engaged in. Okay, so I'm just gonna stop sharing that.
Amazing, Kevin. Thank you so much for taking us through all that information. That was super useful. And I just want to let anyone here know, if you're a land defender, if you're an activist, if you're organizing on the ground and maybe want to do some of these requests and maybe don't have the time or want some support, reach out to Research for the Front Lines. Maybe Keith can put our contact information in the chat again, and we'll mobilize research support to help you. And so now it's time for anyone any participants and guests here today who want to ask Kevin questions, and we're going to prioritize questions from Indigenous or other BIPOC folk first, and then go to anyone else after that. So any folks want to ask some questions, you can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself, and you can also type it in the chat. Okay, opening up to anyone who wants to ask a question.
We have a question from Shireen. Shireen, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Yes, hi. Thanks for all this, Keith, by the way. Fully, I'm not directly involved with stuff right now, but sorry, the speaker had mentioned one particular case of local funding going to some sketchy ass shit. Anyways, I just wondered if that the name of the town or the program the cops were running and shit, if we could hear that again, please. Thank you. Thank you for all this.
Thanks, Shireen.
Was it in relation to the nuclear response forces, or was it before that? Was it in relation to pipeline policing? I can't remember.
I think maybe the latter. It was right not that long ago, like towards the end of your presentation.
Okay. A lot of the places where the militarization of police in relation to nuclear response forces is happening, they're at sites around the nuclear stations in Ontario. So one of them's called Deep River, Ontario.
Yeah, that one I've heard of and stuff. But I sorry to interrupt, but I think you'd mentioned a specific like the name of the project or the town it was in or something. It's okay if not, I can check the recording or something. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I can also send a couple of papers on that topic too, and some of the details, and I even have the ATI disclosure still too. So yeah, but thanks for the question.
Hey, Kevin, we have a question in the chat from Naomi that says, I've found in the past that FOIs can get pretty expensive. Do you have any advice for how to argue for these records to be released for free in the public interest?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a couple of things you can do on the request side of things. Is I do try to break things up so that they're not so expensive. Break up the timelines, break up the record types, and then that way, if you get some free hours of search in that jurisdiction, hopefully, you're not going to get charged for the disclosure. You still could get charged for the disclosure, and sometimes agencies give you these pretty outlandish fee estimates. And in that case, you can actually make a fee waiver. You can request a fee waiver, and you can invoke a few different grounds for a fee waiver. The first is financial hardship. You can invoke financial hardship as part of a fee waiver. And the second grounds for making a fee waiver is public interest. So if you can demonstrate that the matter is one of public interest, and to do that, you have to show, maybe some news stories, some government debates. You can say, look, everyone is talking about this. It's a matter of public interest. Then that could compel them. The third ground, which I think is less successful from what I've seen, is public safety. You can argue, for instance, in some research on SWAT teams that I've done, I got some pretty big fee estimates, and I tried to make a fee waiver, and I did invoke public safety in that one. I said, look, I know there's SWAT teams engaged in community policing, engaged in serving warrants that they shouldn't be according to law. They're engaged in no-knock entries. I think this is a public safety matter, and they didn't go for it. But I tried to argue that the records should be free because that's a matter not only of the public interest but of public safety. So those are the three grounds you can make a fee waiver on. And again, like some of these other pieces, I do pass the fee waivers around to other people. I say, can you think of any other way I can craft this argument? Can you think of any other things I can put in here to make it more compelling? So that's another thing that you could bounce it off somebody else. And then the other strategy is, the one good thing about academics is that they can apply for these big grants from different agencies. And because ATI FOI is starting to be used more in academia, you can actually build this into your grant. So recently I saw someone get a grant. It was like a $320,000 grant over 6 years, and it was all for FOI requests. So if you are working in an activist group or you're mobilizing and you want to incorporate some of this into your work, you can't pay for those fee estimates. They're really outside of reasonability sometimes, but academics might be able to access some of those funds to actually pay the fees.
We have 3 questions. Sorry, go ahead, Jen.
Oh, I was just gonna say, let's go to Charlotte and then Lucy and then Kathy. So Charlotte, over to you, and feel free to put on your video if you'd like. Hi, Charlotte, you're still muted, sorry.
Sorry.
There you go.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. I'm from the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and thank you for this information. It's been very interesting. I have a couple of things. One is more of an observation. I know the Wet'suwet'en, specifically the Unistoten group, have used the request for privacy information quite widely, and it's really helped them stay one step ahead of the action from the RCMP and from the proponents. That was just a comment. And I have 2 questions. One is about Ferry Creek. And I watched in horror how the police treated some of the land defenders there. And it's just horrible, as if you've seen it, I'm sure you would agree. I would like to find out more information about that company, Teal Jones. Like, are they a legitimate company? I heard they were, I don't know if I should be saying this here, but anyway, I've heard that they are all motorcycle gang members. And some of the RCMP that they had looking out for them acted like they were motorcycle gang members themselves. Anyway, it's horrible, and it's like we watched it and the government sat back and did nothing. One other question, and I'm not sure if this fits into your kind of work, Jen Gauby or Dr. Gauby. There's a river in Quebec that was given rights, like human rights for people, right? Do you know about it? I would love to have more information on how we can do that. And right now we're desperately fighting, still fighting the CGL pipeline here in the north. And the CGL is trying to put a pipe under the river so that they can push their oil through. And that is just infuriating everybody. It's so hurtful because it's right up where the sacred headwaters are. And that is our last, really our last river in this area. And we want to save it. So I'm just trying to think of everything that we can do to help save the Wet'suwet'en. So I look forward to getting the information by email from you, Kevin, was it? Yes. And again, thank you very much. It was very interesting information. Thank
you, Charlotte. Maybe I'll just respond by saying, if you don't mind, that so that is the Magpie River in Quebec, and it was the first case in Canada where a river or a non-human, non-corporation got legal rights, the right legal personhood. And this is building off a movement across the world, started in Ecuador, Bolivia, and New Zealand, and where ecosystems and rivers and mountains are getting legal rights that is helping protect them. So Charlotte, if you folks are interested in pursuing that, we could probably do a research project with Research for the Frontlines about this this movement and how it might be able to support Wet'suwet'en's struggles against the pipeline and the coal mine, etc. So if you're interested in pursuing that, let's talk.
I absolutely am, Dr. Walby, because and you're right, the coal mine, they've just currently started another war between the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and the Wet'suwet'en band, pretty much. And what the coal mine proponent is doing is going in the back door, sort of, and going to the band members and asking them for their permission. And I'm pretty sure they know full well they can't do that. The last time that was tried was with CGL, and it caused a big war. I call it a war, but anyway, it's going to happen again because that's what's happening right now. So yes, by all means, all the help we can get, I would appreciate it. Let me know what I can help provide for you. And yes, thank you very much for that.
Let's look into that.
Okay.
Do you mind, Kevin, if we go next to Cedar, who needs to go soon and has some questions? Do you mind, Lucy, too, if we go to Cedar first? Okay, over to you, Cedar. You can unmute yourself and put on your video if you'd like.
Okay, hold on just one moment. I gotta put my headphones in.
Sure.
Hey, what's up? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. What's up? My name is Peter George Parker, straight up from Wet'suwet'en Nation, Toilet Tribe, the Apache Yaqui. So Mexico, Canada, United States. Yeah. I got home in both. I currently work on fighting against standing up to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Just driving around. Actually, like the headwaters of where one of our big cities was. For Coast Salish Nation. I guess the question is, I want to say thank you to everybody first and foremost. I want to say thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the person who just talked I forgot, Kevin. And my background is I've worked around the world doing this type of stuff, from Europe, South America, North America, Oceania, Asia. And I work on both sides, you know, so of the border, right, on the United States and Canada. And so it was really, really interesting to me. And I'd really, really love to get your information. And really what I want the information, get your information so we can create further dialogue on how we can stand up for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Because in our fight, you know, we created a
You were really cutting out there, Cedar. We lost you a bit. Are you still there?
Of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and we also had in the United States and Canada. Can you hear me now? Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, you're back. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. And how long was I got? How long was that for?
Probably about 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. So all right, back to what I was saying. So with the Trans Mountain Pipeline, we've created a 1,200-page assessment document of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, backed up with various scientists around the world. We literally put out a marketing strategy to get people to help us with that. And there's a saying that we say in this fight, you know, no matter how much Kinder Morgan at the time, now the government, no matter how much they did that, what was illegal and immoral, they had the money and the funds to kind of do what they want, you know. And there's also another thing in the United States: if you're rich, you can get away with everything because of their lawyer status or whatnot. And what I'm looking for here is really support, and I'd like to get your information, Kevin, and other people on here who are suitable to help to create further dialogue, right? To help the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, Tsleil tribes on even both sides of the border, because the Trans Mountain Pipeline is going to affect not if, but when it still happens, it can affect more American citizens. And so that's why it's very vital and important to and I can talk on that later if you want my information. But I'm really excited. I do want the book on behalf of the nation. I'd really love your information, Kevin, to come out here and link up with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation and maybe even create some dialogue about how we can move forward about getting free information. And yeah, thank you. So I don't know if you could DM me or I can DM you. I'm really looking forward to creating a more than just dialogue, creating a relationship, right? Because I think this is really how we make movement, right? Creating relationships and creating it's a currency, as we say in the United States. It truly is a currency, and yeah, let's make that currency big when it comes to stopping this pipeline. And so once again, I don't know, maybe Dr. Jen Dobby, that'd be cool if you could DM me. Kevin, that would be nice if you could DM me your information. I can get back to you guys. Yeah, thank you. Because I do have to get off. I have another meeting. I am currently 8 minutes late too. So
thanks for that. Thanks for
yeah.
joining, Cedar, and we'll definitely be in touch.
All right, for sure. I'm just gonna put my phone number in the chat because my phone number and email in the chat because I do have to go.
Okay.
Thank you. Good looking out.
Any responses, Kevin, before we go to the next question?
Yeah, just to what Cedar mentioned and what Charlotte also mentioned, when there are private corporations involved in these practices, and we know that they have these industry partner groups where a lot of the decisions are made, those are meetings from which you can request minutes, you can request correspondence from some of the players. It is possible that they will sever or redact some of those records, but I think it's important to request them. And I would say, for all the reasons that you both mentioned, like this is an example where you could make a public interest fee waiver. You could say, like, there is nothing more in the public interest than these issues, than saving the planet and supporting indigenous groups who are protecting their sovereignty and way of life. There's nothing more in the public interest than that. So I think even though the law is kind of stacked against us, because there is the section that says, third parties, private parties don't have to give up their data. I think there are examples where the records have been disclosed, and it's just a small part of the broader struggle. They're trying to get some of those decisions overturned and arguing, release of private records is in the public interest.
Good. That's a good tip. Let's go to Lucy.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Oh, thanks, Cedar. Sorry. Over to Lucy, and then let me just see, and then Catherine. So go over to you, Lucy.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing this knowledge. It was really comprehensive and helpful. I have two questions, and then Jen, I don't know how we are for time. Did you still want me to quickly talk about?
Yeah, give your tip for sure.
Experience. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Give your tip.
I'll be quick. I guess the quick question is, how should we follow up with you on the book request? And thank you for the generous offer. That's really helpful. But if we'd like a book copy, what's the best way to follow up with you?
Yeah, I'm just going to put this email address here. If you just email this address, I can mail you a paper copy of the book. And if you just send some articles too, I can just print off some articles and send them along with the book, because the articles go into some more details on different parts of making the request. different ideas for analyzing data. So yeah,
Cool,
anyone
thank
who
you.
sends me a note, I'll send you some stuff.
Awesome, thank you. And then the second request, or the second question I had was about when you are making the kind of the Privacy Act request, which I've done a couple ATIP requests, but I've never done Privacy Act. I'm wondering if it's possible to accidentally indict yourself that way, by like if there was an action that happened somewhere and that was potentially arrestable, even if you weren't doing it, if you request a really narrow Privacy Act thing of being like, is there data collection about me at this event at this specific time, could that be used like in court for later? Is that possible?
I'll just put this link here with a little bit more information about invoking the Privacy Act to request personal information. I think when you make the Privacy Act request, there's supposed to be a chain of custody of the records. So, the records aren't going to law enforcement agencies. They're not going to some other agencies. They're not being looked at by prosecutors. So just like with access requests, they're not supposed to know our identity. Only the coordinator knows our identity, but the other people don't. It should be this way too. The records should just go from the coordinator to yourself. However, and your question points to this, I think, we know that this process is also politicized. We know that these requests do get shared, for instance, with the PMO. Sometimes they're red filed or amber lighted, and they get sent up to the PMO, who then gets aware of people making these kinds of requests. And the same thing happens at the provincial level. So I've never heard of a case where someone incriminates oneself by making a Privacy Act request. I do think it's a good thing to be weary of. And I think it speaks to the broader, there are risks to making these kinds of requests, and there are risks to investigating state conduct for people working on the front lines. And that's why I think when it's possible and feasible to like farm out some requests to other groups to do, it's not just because it's a time issue or a resource issue. It might be good to distance yourself from some requests and let someone else absorb some of the heat of the request. And I know that there's a lot of critical lawyers who also use ATI FOI, and they're a good person to do some of that, like absorb some of the heat of some of the requests sometimes, because they have a little bit more stature, I think, socially. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. No, I was one of the people that some of those requests were farmed out to. So I was yeah, as Jen mentioned, she supervised my thesis project, my undergraduate honors thesis at McGill. And I was looking at the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which, as Cedar mentioned, it was owned by a private corporation in the US, Kinder Morgan, until 2018, when the government of Canada bought it. And one of the things, theoretically, it should be easier to get a lot more access through this system on that specific project because it's publicly owned. Whereas before it would have been considered proprietary information of Kinder Morgan, and they wouldn't have released a bunch of it. And I just, I have kind of, I guess, I have a bit of a story that ends with something that I learned, a tip that I wanted to share with people. So yeah, I was doing this project as part of my like thesis, and this was part of how this like idea of research for the front lines was born. And I went through a lot of bad ATIP requests as I went through the process of learning how to file them properly. But I had someone, the ATI coordinator from CERNAC, the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations, call me for one of the clarifications for a document, a bunch of things that I had requested. And I believe it was in completely good faith. And she ended up giving me a bunch of tips on how to file requests with CERNAC and how to expedite the process, because she had seen that I had filed the ATIP request from my McGill University address. So you have to input your email address when you're filing them. I put my McGill address instead of like at mail.mcgill.ca instead of my Gmail. And I guess for the ATI coordinator, that flagged it. And she was like, I'm assuming you're doing this for a school project. So I figured you needed it quickly. And I wanted to make sure that I blah, 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 whatever. So if you're a student and you're filing them, I highly recommend filing it from your university email address, because it not only, kind of gives you a bit of a layer of that like protection and legitimacy, but it also makes you, I don't know, I think she just wanted to help genuinely. And she ended up giving me whatever and helping me narrow it down basically, which is what I was struggling with. So that your presentation helped a lot with that. And the other, I just quickly, a couple other things. One resource that I used a lot was GEDS, because as like the government bureaucracy, whether it's federal or provincial, can be really difficult to navigate and overwhelming and confusing and impenetrable and complicated. But the federal government has a website called GEDS, like GEDS, Government Employee Directory Services. And I think the actual address is like geds-sage.gc.ca or something like that, because it's the French. But that website lists, that's really, really, really helpful, because it basically lists every single public servant in the entire federal government and their phone number. And it also, so it can, if you're, you want to say find correspondences between people, but you're not even sure who those correspondences would be going between, you can like go and find, okay, well, who's the DM or ADM of this specific like unit of this department, whatever, and then find their name on GEDS. But it's also really helpful for just understanding the arms of, just click through basically, and it like is like a little online flow chart that's honestly better than anything else I found to understanding the different arms of all of these bureaucracies. So I really recommend using GEDS. And what was there anything else? I guess just like something crazy also that happened that you were mentioning. You brought up a lot of things that I had gone through, like and I had got a lot of redacted information, like a lot of just blank sheets. And one of these was with CDEV, Canada Development Investment Corporation, and they gave me that like, the attached reasons, here's why what has been redacted is redacted basically. And they like section 18B of the whatever Information Act, and then they attached it. And this part is crazy. Like, I just want to read one of these clauses. So they won't, under the Access to Information Act, they won't release anything that or they may refuse to disclose anything that be materially injurious to the financial interests of a government institution or the ability of the government of Canada to manage the economy of Canada.
Whoa, what the hell?
So section 18B or 18D of the Freedom of Information Act says they don't have to release anything that could be financially injurious to the government. So just an example of yeah, how transparent or how opaque the process can be sometimes, but it's also been really useful. And so yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, Kevin.
Yeah, those are good tips. The employee database, that's a good way to figure out which nodes to mention in a request. And yeah, the redaction issue, yeah, I think that's why, even though ATI FOI seems like it's, kind of boring, not something that activists should be that interested in, it is a site of struggle because they keep adding in all these exemptions that make the act less and less useful. And that's a good one. There's another one in Manitoba where they don't have to release any information that would be embarrassing to the government. And it's like, that's kind of the whole point, is we want to shame the government into doing something right for once. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Kevin. We'll get one last question from Kathy, who's been patient, and then we're gonna start wrapping up. Over to you, Kathy.
Yeah, thanks. Very, very interesting and useful presentation, Kevin, and thanks, Lucy, for all your tips. Great stories. That was so interesting, and so glad you're doing this work. The thing that one of the things that I work on is looking at the corporate capture of our regulatory agencies, particularly on environmental kinds of topics. And just maybe telling a bit of a story here on non-production of documents. Health Canada they were working on this regulatory issue around gene editing. It's a new form of biotechnology. And so they had a bunch of meetings with industry, and they were doing a transparency thing, so we could actually look at these documents that they posted on their websites. Like, wow, you don't even have to do an ATI. But it was interesting on the meeting minutes, most of them said something like, we are going to be recording this meeting for purposes of sharing on our transparency initiative. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Don't say anything that might get you into trouble. And so the minutes were extremely bland. Topics were discussed. And so that looked like clearly a way they were trying to evade scrutiny. And then another way of non-production of documents, which I think is a bit more structural, is regulatory agencies have often set up regulations that require a company to monitor whatever it might be, a water quality or chemical concentrations or things like that, and report those their monitoring data to the government. But since they're produced by a private business, these are considered confidential business information, and you can't get hold of them. If you do an ATI, they say, oh, confidential business information, you can ask the company to send you that data. And of course, the company won't. So anyways, just Kevin, I'd be interested in your opinion on that kind of tactic that the government uses, and maybe is there ways around it?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem because we know that there's this kind of corporate state symbiosis in a lot of these realms of governance. It's not like there's state here and corporation there. They're totally enmeshed in a lot of these things. And then they use the third-party exemption to basically say, we don't have to cough up any of these records. So I think it's still worth asking for them. It's worth making a public interest fee waiver, but it's also worth advocating for the schedule of agencies subject to FOI to change. In other countries, there's variation. In other countries, non-governmental entities, nonprofits are subject to FOI. And I think it should go further. I think anytime a corporation is working in a public-private partnership or whatever kind of collaboration, those records should be seen as in the public interest. So I think, again, thinking about ATI FOI as a site for struggle too, not just as a tool to use to support various other struggles, but thinking about access to information as a site of struggle, and something to see as a realm for cross-movement solidarity is an important thing to do, so that records like that in the future can be released and we can know what's happening there.
All right, well, we're at 8:55 EST. And I just want to take a moment to just thank you, Kevin, so much for sharing all the skills and knowledge you've built up over the years of doing this work. And thank you so much for sharing it and allowing. We're going to share the recording so more people could learn these skills as well. And thanks, Christiane from the Social Justice Center for helping support the event. Thanks to the Hub. And yeah, anyone out there who wants to get involved with research for the front lines, either as a volunteer researcher, or if you're on the front lines and want to get some research happening, we're gonna help support that. So get in touch with us. Maybe Keith could put the contact information one more time in the chat. And thanks to Keith for doing the tech tonight and for helping support the project and the event. So yeah, thanks to all for coming. Thanks to everyone for everything you're all doing to fight for social and environmental justice. Keep up the good work and let's be in touch.